unrest is higher today than it has been in 100 years, and it's getting worse.
During the pandemic, 600,000 people died and millions.
We're going to pass
two people, we'll call them Joe and Cammie work hard, both worked full time last year, putting in 40 hours every week. Together, they made $100,000, just above average for a two-earner household. They're married, they'll file their taxes jointly. So after taking the standard deduction and paying into Social Security and Medicare, they end up with $75,200 in taxable income.
Now let's step back and explain a couple of things. Here's a chart of the federal tax bracket showing how much you pay at each level of income. Everybody gets a standard deduction, and you only pay taxes if you make above that amount. We have a progressive federal income tax system, meaning that you pay a slightly higher percentage of your income in taxes the more money that you make. So after the standard deduction, a married couple filing jointly will pay 10% on the first chunk of their taxable income and 12% on the bit after that, and so on and so forth until they max out at a 37% rate for any income over $622,000. Everybody pays the same rate as they move through the tax brackets, and everyone maxes out at 37%, whether they make $622,000 a year or $622 million.
So back to the work hards. With $75,200 of taxable income after the standard deduction, the work hards will pay 10% of the first chunk and 12% of the rest, for a total federal tax bill of around $8,600.
Now, say two other people, we'll call them Ronald and Melanie Slump. They sit around all year long tanning on a beach. One day, Ronald clicks a button on the couple's E-Trade account and sells some stock, making a profit of $100,000. The Slumps would take the standard deduction and be left with $75,200 of taxable income, just like the work hards. They made the same amount of money, so the Slumps should pay around the same amount of taxes as the work hards, right, Morris?
Wrong. Under our current tax system, the Slumps will pay zero in taxes on that income. The work hards worked hard all year trying to get ahead, while the Slumps, who are already rich, sat on the beach drinking strawberry daiquiris. At the end of the year, the work hards are almost $9,000 poorer than the Slumps. So how does this happen?
I'll tell you how. Republican lawmakers who wrote the new federal tax code believe money should be taxed differently depending on how you make it. Here's a comparison with the rates side by side. Like the work hards, most people make ordinary income. You work, you make money from that work, you get a paycheck, and taxes come out of that paycheck. Other people, and this is mostly millionaires, make capital gains income. You buy an asset like a stock, it goes up. You sell it for a profit. The profit is considered a capital gain. Capital gains income is taxed at a much lower rate than ordinary income. So if you work for a living, you actually end up paying a higher tax rate on your income than people who live off investments. But that's not the best deal in the new Republican tax code. The best deal is to inherit money like Donald Trump did.
Let's say the work hards got new jobs singing full-time for America Sings. They're such good singers that last year America Sings paid them $11 million. They paid Social Security and Medicare, took the standard deduction. They ended up with just under $11 million of taxable income. They pay 10% of the first chunk, 12% of the next chunk, and so on, maxing out at 37% for all the income over $622,000. Work hard's total tax bill for the year, around $4 million. Making $11 million a year is hardly a reason to sing Cry Me a River. But how does the work hard's tax bill compare to the Slumps?
Well, the Slumps also had a very good year. Mr. Slump's great aunt died and left her entire $11 million estate to the Slumps. Don't worry, they weren't close. So how much will the Slumps pay in taxes on their $11 million of inheritance income?
Nothing, zero, nada. When Republican lawmakers rewrote the federal tax code, they exempted the first $11 million of every estate from taxes, over $22 million for a couple. Once again, the work hards and the Slumps took in exactly the same amount of money pre-tax. Because they earned their money in different ways, one couple by working, another by waiting for someone to die, the Slumps ended the year $4 million richer than the work hards.
Okay, so we've talked about income. Now let's talk about wealth. Wealth is the total value of all of the assets a person owns.
Half of all Americans have no wealth at all. But for the ones who do, they may have some money in a retirement account or a stock market account, but the majority of their wealth is their primary residence, their homes. That is not true for most rich people.
While rich people may own several homes, most of them keep their wealth in all kinds of other assets, things like stock, art, jewelry, yachts, and 14 feet long preserved sharks. Yes, that's a thing. And yes, a billionaire paid $8 million for it. So how are different kinds of wealth treated in the tax code, Morris?
Back to the workhards and the slumps. The workhards' wealth is basically their home, a lovely little house in Dayton, Ohio, with an assessed value of $250,000. Homeowners pay around 1.68% in property taxes in Dayton. So for the workhards, the tax on their wealth, their home was around $4,000 per year. They will pay that property tax every single year. The slumps also keep part of their wealth in a lovely little house in Dayton, Ohio, with an assessed value of $250,000. They use it to store their furs in the summer. Like the workhards, they too will pay property tax on that part of the wealth for a total of $4,000 per year.
Now, the Slumps used to own more houses, but Mrs. Slump really does not like taxes. So several years ago, they sold all of their houses except for the one in Dayton. Mrs. Slump was worried her furs would be traumatized by a move. They made $500 million on the sale of all of their other houses. And with that $500 million, the Slumps bought a small yacht, a large plane, 3 Picasso paintings, one from his blue period, a pink diamond, 2 prize racehorses, and 1 decorative flower pot filled with antique gold coins. Morris, what was the total tax bill on that part of their wealth?
Zero, nada, nothing. The workhards have wealth of $250,000. The slumps have wealth of $500,250,000. But the annual tax on their respective wealths is exactly the same.
You may have thought we broke from England and started our own country because we wanted things here to be different. But take a deep dive into our tax code and you'll hear God Save the Queen playing in the background.
That's right, Erica. The Republican lawmakers who wrote the new federal tax code clearly prefer a permanent aristocracy. You want proof? Remember how capital gains taxes work? You buy stock for $1 million, you sell it for $10 million, you only pay tax on that $9 million you gain. And you only pay those taxes if and when you sell the stock. Simple enough. What if you bought that stock for $1 million? It grew to be worth $10 million, but you never sold it. Then you died. And at your death, the stock went to your heirs. In the new Republican federal tax code, when your heirs inherit that stock, poof, the cost basis magically changes. Instead of the basis being $1 million, what you paid for the stock when you first bought it, the basis stepped up to $10 million. The value it had on the day that you died. When your heirs sell the stock, they only pay tax on the gains above the new $10 million value. $9 million of capital gains, totally wiped out for tax purposes.
Another gimmick, called the 1031 exchange, allows investors to avoid capital gains taxes when they sell a piece of property if they immediately invest it in another piece of property. Let's say a builder buys a building worth $10 million, holds it for a few years, and then sells it for $60 million and buys 1,000 buildings with that $60 million. He's $50 million richer, but still has paid no taxes. If he dies, his estate will pay some estate taxes, but his heirs will inherit all of that $60 million property at the new basis. That's how millionaire real estate families acquire billions of dollars worth of property without ever paying taxes.
Let's think about that for a minute. On one side is a wealthy heir who never worked, who inherited millions of dollars and contributed nothing to the country.
On the other side are people like the workhards who go to work, pay their taxes, and do their part for the country every single day.
Between 1/3 and 1/2 of all the wealth in America is inherited. There's nothing wrong with inheriting money, of course. But there's no reason at all that inheritance income should act differently than other kinds of income.
All right, so we've talked about people. Now let's turn to corporations. In 2020, if you bought a single pair of Nike socks, you paid more for those socks than Nike paid in federal taxes for the entire year.
If you sent a single package through FedEx last year, you paid more for your delivery than FedEx paid in federal taxes for all of 2020.
Morris, how does this happen?
There are a lot of ways, but one of the main ones, is the new federal tax code allows companies to pretend they do business somewhere other than where they actually do business. Let's take a company like Starbucks, for example. Let's say Starbucks has thousands of stores in the United States and a few dozen in Ireland. You'd expect them to pay a lot of tax in the US and much less tax in Ireland. That would make sense. That is not the way it works. Most large companies have what's called intellectual property, a trademark or a patent, for example. Unlike land and buildings, intellectual property can be transferred to another country as fast as you can click send on an email. Picture that Starbucks logo. A smart lawyer can transfer ownership of that logo to Starbucks of Ireland, who would then legally own that logo. In order to use the logo, Starbucks of the US would have to send royalty payments to the Starbucks of Ireland. The company can make the royalty payments whatever they want. If they make the payments big enough, the company will show all of its profits in Ireland, where tax rates are much lower, even though they sold hugely more coffee in the United States. Using this and other tricks, 55 large US companies paid zero federal taxes in 2020. Zero. So here we are again, with the workhards holding up their end of the bargain and everyone else shirking their responsibility.
Now, rich people and CEOs love pretending there are really good reasons why they should pay lower taxes than everyone else. Their favorite reason is that they are job creators. Ooh, like they're magicians who create jobs out of thin air just by waving a little wand.
In 2017, there were a lot of CEOs who insisted they would hire more people if Republicans cut the corporate tax rate. They even launched a big job creators bus tour that went all over the country. The CEO of AT&T, Randall Stephenson, is one of the biggest cheerleaders for the corporate tax cut. He insisted the correlation between tax cuts and job creation was very, very tight. Now, keep in mind, corporations only pay tax on their profits. Profits are calculated after expenses like payroll are deducted. So Mr. Stevenson's claim doesn't even make sense on its face. But be that as it may, maybe he was just confused. Maybe he thought he would hire more people if the corporate tax rate was lower.
Morris, I just don't think so. You see, from 2008 to 2015, AT&T paid an effective corporate tax rate of 8%, well below the statutory rate at the time of 35%. During that period, the company cut 80,000 jobs. And since the new Republican tax code went into effect, AT&T has cut an additional 40,000 jobs. And in his last year as CEO, AT&T paid Randall Stephenson $32 million.
Investors like me pay half the tax rate of people who actually work for a living. Lawmakers justify that lower tax rate by saying that investors are job creators and insisting that if we raise their taxes, they won't invest. That just is not true. Let me explain. Apple employs thousands of people to make iPhones and computers. I am an investor in Apple. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Apple stock. But none of the money I spent buying Apple stock even went to the company. It went to other investors who were selling their stock that day. People who work at Apple have jobs because of the millions of customers who want to buy iPhones, not because of investors like me. Consumer demand is the only real job creator. And to be clear, investors are not going anywhere regardless of the tax rate. The alternative to investing is sticking your money in a mattress. Last I checked, mattresses do not provide very high returns.
Regular people pay twice the tax rate that Morris pays. So even if you had the same income that he did, you would end up every single year worse off. But there is good news. We can fix all of this with your help. Right now, Democrats in Washington are deciding who is going to pay for critical investments in our country. Rural broadband and free community college, so every American has the education they need to achieve the American dream. Childcare and elder care, so hardworking Americans can get back to work. This is urgent. These investments must be made. And millionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations must be the ones to pay for it, not regular hardworking people. Please call your congressperson today at 202-224-3121. Again, it's 202-224-3121. and demand that all new investments be paid for by millionaires, billionaires, and multinational corporations. And if you want to know more or join the fight to tax the rich and save this beautiful country of ours, please visit taxtherich.com. Thank you so much.
Tax the rich. Tax the rich, honest to goodness. I think that's just so informative to kind of figure out exactly how that was just happening, you know, how that's going down. I don't see that we've got more yet. So Matthew, I think I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. I've got a slideshow. Is it possible to allow me to share my screen?
No. Yes. I'm looking for you. As soon as I find you here, I'll give you, I feel so important that I can give away these privileges. Okay, you're privileged now.
Okay, great. All right. So, all right, I'm focusing on, here we go. This is the
Oh, you know,
screen.
Matthew, before you get started,
Sure.
just quickly, we've got a couple of candidates here, and I'd like to give them just a second to introduce themselves. I just noticed that Billy has joined us. Billy, do you want to just take one quick minute and introduce yourself here?
Hi, thanks. I'm glad to be a member now, and I really appreciate your endorsement. I'm Billy Palmer, and I'm running for City Council District 2 in Salt Lake City, and just happy to be here. Did you want more than that?
No, you did well, Billy. We'll be rooting for you. And if you want to know about the candidates that the Women's Democratic Club has endorsed, you can get on our Facebook account and you can just go to our photos, and there's an album there with all of our endorsed candidates. And there's another album that I'll send out in the next newsletter. Okay, Matthew, thank you. I just wanted to take a minute there and let him speak.
Terrific. Okay. So let's go here. Okay. So essentially the overview of where we're at is that we're a slow motion Kansas and we have regressive taxes. And I'll go into some of the details about each of those in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So let's see. Voices for Utah Children focuses on two priorities when it comes to state and local taxes. We don't work as much at the federal level. We do occasionally. For example, a few years ago, something came up with making some of the improvements in the earned income tax credit and child tax credit permanent. We're working now on making the child tax credit expansion under the American Rescue Plan permanent, and letting our legislators know our members of Congress know they should support that. But for the most part, we focus on the state level, and we focus on two questions. One is, do we have sufficient revenue? The other is our tax system fair? And I'll start with the first one. And, you know, this inevitably raises the question of, well, what do we want government doing for us anyway? And so since we're, of course, in a very Republican state, I say to the Democratic women, I love to quote the first Republican president when I bring these issues up with our legislators and say that the role of government is to do things for us that we can't do on our own, that we have to pool our resources in order to be able to get things done. And that's just a very practical way of doing it. And to be able to point to the nation's first Republican president as saying that that's what government should do seems like a pretty safe way of making that case here in conservative Republican Utah, right? But the direction that we've seen with the overall level of taxation in Utah has been on a strong downward slope going back to ever since the 1980s. Those of us who are my age and older may remember that was the age of Reagan, when suddenly government could do no good and taxes were a waste of money. And so at that point, we started the whole tax cutting craze at the federal level, at least for upper income people at the federal level. and at the state level. And when you add up how much we've cut Utah taxes, we looked back to 1995 and we found that we've been passing on average $100 million of tax breaks every year for the last 25 years. Adds up now to about $2.5 billion each year of revenue that we don't have. It makes up about 18% of Utah's $14 billion of annual revenue. And the reason why we raised this question of whether that makes us a slow motion Kansas is because in the last decade, Kansas, the state of Kansas, under Governor Sam Brownback, ended up with a political and economic disaster from cutting taxes overnight by 15%, which you'll note is less than Utah has cut taxes, but over a longer period of time. And it led to a tremendous political backlash in Kansas. They even elected a Democratic governor in response to that. And the legislature ended up reversing the tax cuts and restoring the public revenues, overriding the governor's veto to do it. It really brings to mind the analogy of, here in Utah, we're kind of like the frog in the pot of gradually boiling water, where we've done the same kind of tax cutting, but because we've done it more gradually, I guess, we haven't seen the same sort of public backlash about it. But it really does raise the question of whether we're thinking too much about the short term and about immediate gratification. I love to quote Clayton Christensen about this, that in the business world, one of the biggest problems is thinking too much about short-term profits and immediate gratification. And the same logic certainly should apply when it comes to government policy. And are we thinking too much about wanting more cash in our pockets today and not enough about what is good for Utah in the long run? Because we have tremendous unmet needs in so many areas of state responsibility. Of course, education is generally at the top of everyone's agenda in Utah. And we do arguably get better bang for the buck than other states, which is great. But we also pay a price for all the tax cutting we've been doing. Our high school graduation rates are below national averages when you adjust for demographics. So that, for example, if you're white in Utah, you're no more likely to graduate high school than if you're white nationally. But if you're a member of one of Utah's rapidly growing non-white groups, for example, our Latino minority, which now makes up nearly 20% of our children, you're actually 3 points behind the overall Latino high school graduation rate nationally. And that puts you 11 points behind the white high school graduation rate in Utah. So we actually have majority minority gaps like that in Utah that are larger than nationally. If you look at college completion, you see that the older generation of Utahns was well ahead of their peers nationally, but with each successive generation, we've been losing that lead. And among millennials, we've actually lost it. Millennials among Utahns aged 25 to 34 are actually behind their counterparts nationally for getting bachelor's degrees and above. When you go back to the youngest level, the kindergartners and pre-K and childcare, we don't have these things available to most Utahns at a rate that they can afford. And we're going to pay a price for that in the long run. In terms of public health, we have one of the highest uninsured rates in the nation, last in the nation for Latino children. Infrastructure, the business community projects that we have billions in unfunded needs over the coming decades. There's much more we could be doing for poverty prevention. There are many social services such as mental health, substance abuse treatment, disability services, domestic violence, and others that we're not meeting the needs that are out there in our communities, including in rural areas that are seeing population losses because people are abandoning them because they can't get the services and the jobs they need. Of course, air quality and many other areas. There are just tremendous unmet needs in many areas where we haven't had the resources. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on state education investment for a minute, because we did get some good news this year. The Census Bureau releases data every year on a 2-year lag, comparing all the states for how much they're putting into education. Utah historically had been last place among the states, 50th, 51, 51st place if you count DC. Well, the good news was that when the numbers came out earlier this year, we won the fight for 49th place. We defeated Idaho, our perennial rival, for 49th place. We outspent them 2 years ago by $29 per pupil. Of course, that's over $5,000 behind the US average, but it's certainly good news to get out of last place, right? But the bad news was that even as we were getting out of last place, our education funding effort continued to fall. Education funding effort is when you look at how much we're putting into K through 12 education as a percent of our state personal income. And you can see that back in the 1990s, we were in the top 10 nationally, and we were putting in between 5 and 6% of our incomes into education, depending on whether you look at the red line is not counting capital investment. The blue line is overall, including building and repairing schools. Well, when you look at the trend on that, and you see where we are in the last few years, you can see that we've fallen to the lowest 10 or 15 nationally. And even in the year when we got out of last place in 2019, it continued to fall from 4% to 3.9% of our incomes. So our education funding effort continues to decline. That's a real concern, obviously. Tax fairness is the second issue that we focus on. And there are times when our two priorities are in tension with each other. There are times when we want to see a tax cut for low-income Utahns, such as removing the sales tax from food or passing a state earned income tax credit, where that does cost the state revenue. So it's always a matter of balancing that and figuring out what's the best thing to do in any given year. But in terms of tax fairness, there's a national organization, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, that publishes data on this, which is tremendously informative. And that's where we generated this research from, where this shows what's the overall effective tax rate that Utahns at different income levels are paying in their state and local taxes. And you can see here that the blue line represents where we were in 1995, where if you were in the lowest quintile, you were paying 12% of your income in state and local taxes. And if you were in the highest 1%, you were paying 7.8%. Well, we've cut taxes for everyone since then. We've actually, in percentage terms, we've cut taxes the most for the lowest income Utahns. And we've actually introduced an element of progressivity into our tax code, where we previously, in 1995, had a classic regressive pattern where the rich paid the lowest rate and the poor paid the highest rate. We now have a progressive tax structure up to about $80,000 or $90,000 of income, up through the fourth quintile. But then it starts going down again, and similar to the pattern at the national level, the highest income Utahns pay the lowest state and local tax rate. And it's important to understand the role of the state income tax in our overall tax structure. It's our only non-regressive tax, and it follows what I call the 3/5, 1/5 rule, where 3/5 of the income tax is paid by the top 1/5 of taxpayers, which lines up almost exactly with our income distribution in Utah. And all the other taxes are regressive in nature and make up the majority of taxes for most Utahns: the sales tax, the gas tax, the property tax. I'm not going to spend much time talking about what happened in the most recent legislative session, other than to say that We passed $100 million of tax cuts. They were sold to the public as being tax cuts for low and moderate income Utahns. They were not. They mainly went to the highest income Utahns, unfortunately. And the proposals, such as our earned income tax credit for low income working Utahns, did not get passed. Let's see. And you might have caught my op-ed in the Tribune at the end of the legislative session, headlined "The High Price of Lower Taxes in Utah," the price that we pay for continually cutting taxes. Now, one thing I wanted to take a couple of minutes to focus on in the last couple of minutes here before I wrap up. What does the Utah public say about tax cuts? And it's interesting that what public opinion polls show is not consistent with what the legislature is doing on this, as on probably many issues. This is something from a year and a half ago that found that in the Deseret News, this Hinckley Institute poll, when you asked people, what should the state do with its surplus? This was pre-pandemic. Only 10% said cut taxes. There's other research that's been done, such as by the Utah Foundation, where they found that 74% of Utahns were willing to pay higher taxes for things like better schools, better infrastructure, better air quality. Envision Utah has done a poll almost every year in recent years where they've asked about what about putting more money, paying higher taxes to improve education funding, and they found that where it was just half that were willing to do that 5 years ago, now it's up over 3/4 in the most recent survey that they did. And then the most sort of conservative result that we saw was during the legislative session, and of course in the midst of the worst of the pandemic, when 41% favored tax cuts, but 53% favored more investment in Utah's future in a variety of ways. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that public opinion is with us on this. The biggest threat that we're concerned about is the proposals from the Utah Taxpayers Association to cut the income tax rate further. They're focused on trying to cut the income tax rate to 4.7% from the current 4.95%, even to 4.5%. And we just saw last week, the Senate Majority Leader, Evan Vickers, has introduced a bill that would begin that process by cutting the income tax rate from the 4.95% to 4.9%, would cost the state about $65 million in revenue, would continue that pattern that we've been seeing over the last generation and more of cutting about $100 million on average every year and stymieing our ability to make the investments we need in our future. And unfortunately, the biggest part of those tax cuts that we've done have gone to the highest income Utahns and not gone to average working people. So that's my presentation. Robin asked me to try to keep it to 15 minutes. I see I've gone a little bit over, so sorry about that, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Well, and we now have also with us, we've got Morris Pearl calling in from New York. Hey, Morris, how are you?
Hi.
Morris, now I want to tell everybody, I'm so glad you're with us, Morris. There's Morris Pearl. He's the chair of Patriotic Millionaires. And all of you on the call today will be receiving a copy of his book, Tax the Rich. And we're thrilled to have you here with us. We did watch the video to begin with, and I have a question, and I think there probably will be others with questions. You say call and tell our legislators or our Congress people that to tax the rich. But what specifically does your organization have some specific suggestions that you want us to, like estate taxes, or is there a more pointed recommendation?
Yeah, the basic thing that we're looking at reflects the same things that Mr. Weinstein was just talking about. The fact that those of us who are wealthy, investors and business people like me, are paying much lower tax rates than people who work for a living. And that's because at the federal level, we have two systems, one for investment income. If I buy stock and it goes up for years and I sell it and make a gain, that's taxed at rates of 0, 15, and 20%. Whereas if you get a paycheck with tax deducted from that paycheck, that's taxed at rates of starts at 10% and goes up into the 30s. And that's the basic complaint that we have, is that people that work for a living are paying much higher tax rates than we who are already wealthy and simply getting money from our wealth without having to work.
Oh, that just seems so wrong. Does anybody have any questions for Morris? I know this has to be a very solemn day in New York, and that's where you're calling us from today, correct?
Yeah, I rode my bike down the street here, and St. Patrick's Cathedral was lined with firefighters in their fancy dress uniforms, and there's all kinds of ceremonies going on. And yeah, I mean, people are remembering the thousands who were killed that day 20 years ago.
Morris, maybe you can, thank you for that. It is such a somber occasion. Morris, can you tell us just a little bit more about Patriotic Millionaires and what else you're doing other than the roadshow? We watched, tell us a little bit more about what your initiatives are.
We have a group of a couple hundred members and a couple dozen staff people. And basically it's wealthy people, not quite at the level of Tom Steyer, who has his own personal political staff, but sort of normal millionaires who, instead of having their own personal staff, share our staff of a couple dozen people. I think we're up to 24 now. And basically we get our members to speak out, to speak to legislators, to speak to journalists, to speak at rallies, to go on TV and, on the, interview shows. Mm-hmm. And explain that it's actually not in the best interests of most business people and investors to have a country with just a few rich people and everyone else not getting by. That's not the country we grew up. That's not the kind of country that we want our children and grandchildren to grow up. I'd like them to have the opportunities to invest and build businesses and get ahead the way I did. And the rate we're going, it's not happening. Mm-hmm. And when I was a teenager, they tried that in South Africa. That did not end well for the rich people either, as you may recall. So I'm hoping that we can convince our Congress people, and right now, this weekend and the next couple of weeks is the time that they collectively are going to make a decision on which way our country is going to go. And so we've been sort of organizing our members and anyone else who wants to be organized to call them, to call their representatives and try to get to a point where we get a majority in favor of the reconciliation bill they're working on to implement, the president's proposals to raise the taxes on the rich in order to pay for investments, basically, as Mr. Weinstein was talking about, but at a national level.
Yes, so much. Does anybody else have a question for either for Matthew or Morris? Either one? John, you've got a
Dr.
question.
Brady there's a question in the chat too.
All right, John, why don't you come up with your question? I'll check out the chat.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to address this to Morris.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the specifics of the battle to change back the estate tax, and maybe give us some ideas about messaging for our reps, both local and national, in terms of examples or data or even court influence through the probate system, because that, by your roadshow, seems to be the most egregious regression since our youth.
Yeah, we've talked about a couple of items. One is that after you at the time when you die, your estate passes on to your heirs, and there's no tax at all on the first 20 some odd million, assuming you're married or were married. That means that your heirs collectively can receive up to 20, I forget the exact number, 23 odd million, tax-free completely. And secondly, if you have investments, like say you started a business with nothing and it became worth billions and billions of dollars, like Walmart or Amazon or any of a number of businesses that were created, when your heirs inherit that business, assuming you still owned it at the time that you died, when they go to sell it, when they calculate their profit, it's the amount that they get minus their cost, but their cost isn't what you paid for it, which may have been nothing. Their cost is what it was worth on the day that you died.
Sure.
So if it goes from, zero to billions during your lifetime, and then your heirs sell it, they pay no tax at all on all that capital gain, all that gains you accumulated over all that time. That's called the step-up basis rule. That's one of the other things that Congress is discussing now. And then the other side always comes up with Kristi Noem's mother, who complains about having to pay taxes inheriting a farm from her husband, which of course, there's no tax at all inheriting from a spouse. B, she's not dead, she's still alive, and she hasn't sold the farm, so it's a complete lie. And C, we've no problem exempting actual legitimate family farms. As you may know, the largest family farms are actually billions of dollars worth of farmland that's owned by Bill Gates. So family farm can mean different things to different people. But I mean, I'm not talking about taxing farmers who've accumulated a few $1 million worth of land and may or may not be making a lot of money. We're talking about taxing billionaires who've built big businesses over time, at the time when their heirs inherit those businesses. So that's what we mean by the step-up basis rule.
Thank you, Morris. Good question. Dr. Brady, did you have a question?
Yeah, the question I think is one of you talk about investment in income, and I couldn't agree with you more. There's been a couple of issues relative to that. One is that a lot of people are people like me that invested in 401ks over the course of their careers and then depend on that investment income for retirement. Then there was also this thing called the alternate minimum tax or something like that, that basically did tax you based on estimated value of your holdings at any given time if you had, for example, stock options or whatever. But then if the stock didn't perform, you paid taxes on income that was theoretical and on paper only and didn't actually pan out in terms of actual real income. So I guess part of my question is building in some sort of cutoff line for those that are billionaires, if you will, versus the average American that does their investment in funds for retirement and whatever.
Yeah, first of all, the changes proposed wouldn't make any difference at all for 401ks because people withdrawing their money from the 401ks don't actually get this benefit anyway. Because the money's tax deductible when you put it in, you pay full freight when you withdraw money from your 401k. So you actually don't get a tax benefit on 401k withdrawals. And so, I mean, there's no proposal to change that at all, actually. And so secondly, when we're talking about the stock options, what happens is if you work for some company and you are receiving some compensation for your labor, you have taxable income. And if that compensation comes in cash as wages or salary, that's easy to quantify and deducted from your pay. And as some of it is deducted, and you know how to calculate a tax on that. If some of that compensation is stock in the company, either options or shares, then some of those options or shares, some of that's taxable income too. And then what happens is sometimes those shares are worth far more than you go to sell them. Those are the successful companies. And, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Bezos are receiving the benefits of that now. Occasionally, those shares become worth nothing at the time that you sell them, and you have a huge loss. And that's when people, sometimes paid income tax on some income, but then have a loss later. And so would need to get the benefit of that loss at that, whenever they have the loss too. So again, we're not proposing raising taxes on people that make less than millions of dollars a year. But we are proposing raising, taxes on people who do make millions of dollars a year. That situation actually wouldn't change either with the proposals that we've seen, because those aren't long-term capital gains anyway. So the proposals we've seen, I don't believe would change the situation at all. When stock is part of someone's pay from their employer.
Good. Thank
Yes.
you. I'm going to address one last quick question, and then we're going to be out of time. And I want to address this to Matthew a little bit more locally here. Matthew, the Zoo Arts and Parks tax, that made it because it had a name. I mean, we were able to get that passed because everybody likes the zoo, everybody likes the arts and parks, presumably. I wonder if we need to go at this and propose a tax that's for children, education, the kids matter tax increase. Because I don't think you're ever going to sell a tax increase unless we name it and we make sure that that's where it goes, just like the zoo, arts and parks. I don't know. What is your thinking on that?
I think you're absolutely right. And it shows where you have the divergence between public opinion and the legislature, where the public votes regularly for tax increases, especially at the local level for things like that. And we also saw, remember the Our Schools Now initiative back in 2017
right,
and 18, before they unfortunately made, I think, a bad deal with the legislative leadership to pull the initiative, which, it was the way they had it structured. It was that we all signed the petition to put it on the ballot before they pulled it. It was $750 million a year, 2/3 of that from the income tax, which, as I said, is a progressive tax. 1/3 of it was from the sales tax, which is the regressive tax, but it was mostly progressive. And the polls showed the public was going to vote for it. I think they made a mistake by pulling it. And I think it's worth thinking about, is that the way we need to go in the future? Do another sort of Our Schools Now in order to get the kind of investment we need in our future that our legislature just hasn't been willing to support.
Mm-hmm. And particularly right now, especially for schools, because they are so stressed out and needing so desperately the funds. Well, we are 1 minute till 1 o'clock, and by golly, we're going to end on time today. And I want all the credit for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, everybody take yourself off mute. Take yourself off mute for just a second, because we're all going to get to say goodbye. I want to thank Morris. You were fabulous joining us from New York City. Thank you so much. I'm going to read your book. Everybody's going to read your book. And we're going to get in touch with our Congress people. We are going to do it. Matthew, you were fabulous as always. You're always just great. It's such wonderful information. Everybody take yourself off mute right now and say goodbye or say to hello.
Bye,
To everybody
thanks.
else
Say
here.
thank
All right,
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
You were fabulous. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Kelsey, thank you for
Thank you,
joining.
Matthew.
Eleanor,
Thanks,
Ellen,
Robin.
hi. Marty, thank you so much. Good to see you. Vicky, thank you. Thank you. Representative Moss. Tax the rich, Representative Moss.
Yes, yes, please do it.
Get busy and go out there and tax those people.
Tax my dad.
Feel free to be in
Carol,
touch if you want.
Tax my dad.
Okay, go for it.
There you go. We'll work on that.
You can tell them I sent you.
Thank you for Annabelle. Thank you for joining us.
Love it.
Keep up the good work. I hope you recorded your speech at the march. It was so wonderful. All right.
We're there. Thank you.
Dr. Brady, I'm planning for that editorial to be in tomorrow's paper. I'm going to be disappointed if it's not.
It was on the, it's online already.
Yeah, I know it's online, so everybody can read her editorial online. Matthew, you're fabulous. Thank you all.
Thanks,
We'll
Robin.
see you
Thank
October
you.
the 9th. All right.
Hey.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Tax the rich. Tax the rich.
Thank you.
Tax the rich.
Thanks, everybody.
Tax the rich. Okay, see you guys.
Tax the rich.
Tax the rich.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.